All right, well, I want to welcome everybody to our Dairy Goat webinar series. My name is Jennifer Bentley, and I'm a dairy field specialist here in Northeast Iowa. And today we're going to kick off the last of our webinar series for the, I guess, early spring and into summer. And then we're going to take the summer off and come back in the fall. So I do also have my colleague Fred Hall on the call here today, and he's going to help moderate the chat, and we'll take questions as we uh, see those come in. But as a reminder, we will start back up our webinar series in September. So you can see here, we will have some dates, September 18th, coming back talking about respiratory disease in dairy goats. And then October 23rd, talking about small ruminant abortion diagnostics. And then in November, I'll have a date determined by early fall, and we'll talk about common diseases in small ruminants. So those are some upcoming things that we'll have going on. But today we're going to be focusing on biosecurity and preparing for our goat shows, as we know that those are coming up shortly. And we're all getting into that busy season. So we invited Dr. Rachel Friedrich from the Iowa State University College of Vet Medicine to get us prepared for goat shows here and give us some good tips as we enter the show season. So a little background about Dr. Friedrich. She grew up on a family farm in Northeast Nebraska, where her interest in production animal veterinary medicine began. Dr. Friedrich received a BS in Ag Sciences, majoring in animal science from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, followed by a DVM from Iowa State University College of Veterinary Medicine. She then practiced mixed animal medicine and surgery in West Central Iowa and worked in veterinary biologics industry, developing vaccines for livestock prior to returning to Iowa State University. And so currently, Dr. Friedrich is a senior clinician and section head of the Food Animal and Camelid Field Services Unit, with a focus on providing veterinary curriculum instruction and professional services in small ruminant and bovine medicine and surgery. And in her free time, what little free time she has, from what I hear, her and her husband Ryan keep busy with their two twin daughters' activities, including several sports and pets. So thanks for getting us on your busy schedule, Rachel, and we appreciate the information that you're going to share here today. And with that, I'm going to let you go ahead. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you'll be able to share yours.
So this is kind of a topic that is near and dear to my heart because besides my role at field services at Iowa State, I am the team lead for the veterinary services at the Iowa State Fair. And so I kind of lead a team of about 7 to 10 people and 6 students that provide vet services there. So there's an awful lot of exhibition medicine and exhibition regulatory requirements that our group does in the year. And so that's kind of one of the reasons why I proposed this topic, is just simply as kind of a refresher, a reminder for all of us as we're really getting into that busy show season. I mean, if you've been through biosecurity chats before, you're probably not going to hear something that's going to be absolutely earth-shattering, or I'm going to turn that on its head. I'll put that out right away. But what we're hoping for out of this talk is that it makes you kind of think about the things that you're doing, maybe reevaluate some of your plans, and find some plans to put together for this late spring and summer fall show season, so that we're able to keep not only our own animals, but other herds as safe and healthy as possible. So just to start off with, what is biosecurity, right? So we hear this word constantly anymore. At least in my world, it's constantly thrown out there. It's almost just become a buzzword for us. And the more we use something as far as a buzzword, right, the more it can actually kind of lose its meaning for us. And so what we're going to talk about today is that typically our goal for biosecurity is to prevent infections from occurring on our farm. So prevent pathogens from entering our farm. But in reality, most of the time, what we end up doing is actually just reducing that disease. That's a laudable goal in itself. You know, there's lots of considerations to this, and there is no perfect world to this. So I'm going to put in a plug immediately for the Center for Food Safety and Public Health at Iowa State University. It's a mouthful. CFSPH is a group that does a ton of educational things for things like biosecurity and disinfection. They have a great website. It includes checklists for biosecurity questions that you might have. There's disinfection protocols and how to select the right disinfectant. There's information on various diseases. There's just an awful lot of stuff there. It is included in the resources at the end of this presentation and also in the webinar notes document that I included for this talk. And if you lose that stuff, just Google Center for Food Safety, Iowa State, and you'll be able to find it. Lots and lots of really good stuff there. And so I'm borrowing some things from there for this presentation. This diagram that's up here on the screen right now is one of those things. So typically when we're thinking of biosecurity, we're thinking of our farm. So that one premise and the animals that are included on it and all the things coming and going that could potentially bring disease with them. And so in this diagram, they draw this red line around the premise that's kind of like our border that we're trying to protect. That doesn't work nearly as well when we get into shows. And so we'll kind of talk about some of those differences as we go through the presentation today. But before we get that far, we just kind of need to talk about disease in itself and kind of how does disease develop? So what are the factors, if we get really down to the basics, what are the factors that are involved in the development of that disease? So if we take it down to those basic buckets of a actual illness developing in our animal, we're talking about interaction between the host or the animal that becomes infected, the pathogen, the virus, the bacteria, the parasite, the fungus, all of those type of things that infect the host, and then their environment that they're in. And where those things overlap there with that gold star in the middle, that's where our disease develops, is when we get the interaction of all those three things. So if we're looking at these components that are interacting, which of these are involved in the development of biosecurity plans? Kind of a trick question because, of course, we're going to talk about all of them. So when we're looking at these three components to disease, what kind of influence can we have to either negate the risk of disease or actually promote it, which is the last thing we really want to do. But so when we're looking at this is not an all-inclusive list of things that we can influence, but it's to give us that kind of idea of where we start. So if we're looking at our hosts, we're looking at the animals on our farm, our dairy goats. When we're reducing the stress that those animals are undergoing, that's going to allow that immune response to be stronger. So we're avoiding doing things that will stack one stressor on top of another. We really don't want to make a big ration change right before we're going to go to a show. You know, those are two stressful events for that animal and going to overall decrease that immune response. What is their current immune status? Have we used any vaccines? Have they had a prior exposure? Are there pregnant animals involved here that would not have as strong of an immune response? I throw acclimation on here. It's not as big of an issue for the dairy goats, but if you happen to have show calves that you're keeping in a cooler throughout the spring, it's pretty important for us to start taking them out of that cooler as we get close to that state fair time, so they're used to the heat that they're going to experience when they're not housed in that original environment more. When we move on to the pathogens, really what we're shooting for there is just decreasing the amount that our animals are exposed to, right? So we're trying to decrease that exposure level as much as possible. That can be by avoiding contact with other animals. It can be by cleaning and disinfecting equipment, approaches to just reduce their overall exposure. And then our influence on the environment is typically those husbandry things that we think about. High air quality within a building to reduce our risk of respiratory disease. Are we housing them at an appropriate temperature for the age and stage of the animals that we're taking care of? I get it. Sometimes it's really hard, right? If we have open pastures and open buildings and Mother Nature likes to throw big swings at us, that can be a little bit tough to manage. But if we can do it, that's going to help reduce the stress on the animal too. Same thing with nutrition, providing them with enough protein and enough energy that they are able to meet not only their maintenance needs, but also their production needs as well. Typically, when we think about our biosecurity approaches, we're mostly targeting the environment and the pathogen as far as those components that we're going to design most of the approach around. And how we do that is by knowing what exposure routes we have and the risks of exposure to help us design those control approaches. So this is a diagram of the types of exposure routes, the common types of exposure routes that our farm animal species are going to come across, and got a nice little alpine doe here in the middle to kind of show you examples of some of the ways that our animals are exposed by each of these routes. So the direct contact route, that one's pretty self-explanatory, right? A contact from one animal to another can pass a pathogen. The fomite route is one that we often forget about because that's transmission of a pathogen through an inanimate object, right? So people, our hands, our shoes, our clothes, all of those kind of things can become contaminated. The vehicles that we use to transport those animals or to bring tack or feed or other equipment back and forth, and then the equipment that we have, like clippers and milking equipment and things that way, all can be sources of pathogen transmission. We all got pretty used to talking about aerosol transmission during our COVID days, right? You remember our separation, to the separation that we were trying to do to limit the cough and sneeze and droplet transmission. That's the same thing for our animals, for primarily our respiratory diseases. And being in a shared airspace actually increases our exposure level there too. On the other side, we have the fecal oral transmission. So infected feces that contaminate feed or feeding equipment, waters, things like that, can then be ingested and cause an infection in the intestine because of that. And then finally, the vector method. So this is insects or an insect transmission. Some of our pathogens require an insect to be transmitted from one animal to another. An example of that is some of our tick-borne diseases. Others, it's simply by mechanical transmission on their feet. So face flies up and around the eyes, transmitting pink eye to the next animal when they land on their face and touch the surface of their eye. So just a couple examples here of some of the prevention methods that we use by the route of exposure. And as you look at this slide here, I know there's an awful lot going on, but there are some general themes that you can see as you look at the slide. For example, if we have a direct contact, a fecal oral or aerosol transmission route, separating those animals is going to be important for us to limit the exposure, right? So spreading them out, making it be an appropriate stocking density, or not bringing animals that we've recently taken to a show right back into our barn, separating those animals out to break that infection cycle. You'll see a lot of clean and disinfect on these slides too, which is why I put that plug in for the CFSPH, because they have some great resources there on selecting disinfectants. But simply cleaning the manure, the other organic matter, the dirt off of that equipment and facilities can be as helpful to reduce that pathogen load as the disinfection protocols in some cases. Limiting the visitors that we have to our farms or to our trailer when we're showing just reduces the risk of somebody accidentally bringing something in, and using physical barriers. So general themes involved with all these exposure routes that can help us limit that contact. So a note here about zoonotic diseases. So zoonotic diseases, if you're not familiar with those, are infections that can be passed from an animal to a person. We should always be assuming that it's possible that our animals could be carrying something infectious to us. I understand it. I grew up in it too. We get really comfortable around them, and we oftentimes this is the last thing on our mind. But especially when we're dealing with people that have special need considerations, like small children that don't have as strong of an immune system as us as adults. And also for anybody like me that has kids, right? They're not always the greatest about washing their hands and not putting things in their mouths either. And so because of that, they're a special consideration for potential exposure to these diseases. Also, people that are pregnant or have health concerns like if you're going through chemotherapy or anything that way, those are going to reduce your overall immune response and how strong your immune system is, and make it more likely for you to accidentally pick something up. And so because of that, we're putting special considerations onto this. In the webinar notes, there's a lot more information about using personal protective equipment like gloves and coveralls and things like that. I included that there, less so in this actual talk. But just a reminder that, at minimum, the boots that we're wearing in the barn should be for the barn only, not coming into the house. Same thing with coveralls or designated barn clothes, that they stay out of our living areas and they have a designated place to return to. When you're dealing with sick animals, wearing gloves is really important to help protect not only yourself, but also from transmitting to the next animal, because you can take the gloves off and throw them away before you touch the next animal. Some examples of zoonotic diseases that we see in dairy goats can be ringworm, unfortunately, or ORF, which is also known as sore mouth or contagious eczema. And then unfortunately for us, like anytime we're dealing with a small ruminant abortion disease, there's a high risk of a zoonotic potential there. So those are special considerations for us. This picture here is an example, and it's kind of hard to see because of the coloration of the goat, and I apologize for that. But if you look right up there along its lip line where the lip meets the hair, you'll notice that there's some kind of crusted areas and some sores there along the corners of his mouth. This is a little goat that's going through the healing stages of ORF or sore mouth. And so you notice that the person in this picture is wearing gloves. They don't want to be touching those areas because those scabs actually contain a lot of virus that can pass to people and causes some pretty painful, nasty blisters on hands when that happens. So wearing gloves is an important part of the biosecurity for this, not only to protect the person, but also the handler then is going to take those gloves off and the booties that are in the bottom of the picture, going to take all that stuff off before they go into the next group of animals, so we're not accidentally moving things around there. Wear your PPE. When in doubt, wear your PPE. What can we do about the host? So things we can do for the host, we're going to try to do everything we can to maximize that immune response, because we know that no matter how hard we try, we're not putting these animals in a bubble. There's going to be exposure at some point. What we want to do is have that immune system be able to attack and handle that pathogen when it's exposed before it actually causes disease. So again, no stress stacking. Try to avoid putting multiple stressful things on at the same time. Weaning kids and shipping them immediately, pretty stressful for those animals. So if we can wean prior to shipping, that's very important for us. Other things we can do, we have limited availability of vaccines for small ruminants, but there are some really good ones that are out there that we can use to give our animals' immune system a controlled exposure ahead of time so that it can then respond when it sees that actual virus later on. Just like I've talked about multiple times, I keep mentioning immune response and immune competence. So if we're heavily parasitized, if we have a heavy load of barber pole worms, their immune system is trying to attack those all the time. It just can't do a very good job of it. It's also not very good at fighting on multiple fronts. So if it's focused on parasite control, it's not also going to be able to respond well to a respiratory disease. So keeping those parasites under control helps the immune system. Again, proper nutrition and acclimation, like we've already discussed, just to help reduce that stress and get that body ready to respond. So now we've talked about disease and the routes of transmission and things that way. And now we're going to dive into the actual biosecurity planning from here. So just like with everything else, when you're getting ready to start show season, you're starting to put your plan in place. What animals are we going to show and in what categories? Which shows are we going to go to? What equipment do we need to purchase? Things like that are all in our head. So this should also be part of our planning process before we start the season too. A lot of what we're going to talk about is protecting the herd at home as much as the animals while they're at the show. And so a lot of that starts with doing a risk assessment. These are just a few of the questions to ask yourself as far as trying to determine the risk for your actual herd at home, and the risk that you're undertaking while you're going to those exhibitions. CFSPH, again, has a risk assessment tool that's on their website, so you don't have to come up with all these questions on your own. The tool allows you to check the boxes for what activities you're participating in and how frequently you're participating in them. All of that together gives us an overall risk in the different categories of exposure and helps us target what we can do to mitigate that risk. So when we come down to managing the risk to our herd and to our individual animals, we'll often use this term called enhanced biosecurity. Well, what does that mean, right? So that's typically, we're thinking of those swine multiplier herds that are seed stock and are producing gilts all over the country, right? Those are the farms that are going to be locked down, a closed premise with very limited visitors, a closed herd with no in and out, routine disease testing, all of that going together. That's great. That's awesome, but it's not feasible in all situations. So just because we can't achieve that level doesn't mean there aren't things that we can do to kind of support our own biosecurity. What else we can do often means identifying our risk and then directing towards that. So in these next few slides, we're going to go through the different routes of exposure. We're going to go through a hierarchy from a poor plan all the way up to an excellent plan, of some examples of things to do to manage that direct contact. This is primarily designated towards the return home from the show. So these next slides are going to talk mostly about return home from the show and how to manage that risk for the animals at home when we're returning. So a poor way maybe to manage our direct contact risk for our animals at home is to put multiple herds on the same trailer. Yep, it's really efficient to have you and your neighbors and your friends all haul together on the same trailer. But if we mix all those animals together, we're mixing the diseases from multiple farms. We're exposing animals to things they aren't exposed to. Another thing that might be tough on our animals that at home is we come back from a show that we've been at for 3 days and we just put everybody back together without any kind of separation. A better approach or an okay approach would be to bring those animals home to a separate pen where they have no nose-to-nose contact, but it's in the same facility. So we do still have that airspace possibility. To haul together, okay, but no mixing on the trailer, right? Can we provide a barrier in between those animals? Probably a better approach would be if we come home and we're able to put those animals in an isolation or quarantine facility, a separate barn on the same premise so that we're not crossing contact. And we only haul our own animals. We don't take anybody else's along with us. Our best approach is actually going to be a separate premise for our show herd. So a separate farm that we can house on for the animals that are coming and going for multiple shows throughout the season, just to limit the contact as much as possible. If they would pick something up, it's much less likely to make it a mile down the road than it is across a fence. I understand all of us would love to have the facilities and the new barns, and it's not always feasible. So that's why we're talking about a hierarchy today. You'll also see that separation and separate facility or separate premise pop up on multiple risk categories here, just simply because it is a very good way to manage all of the routes of exposure, if you can swing it. So when we're talking about those fomites, those inanimate objects, a poor approach would be we just share stuff without cleaning it. Like, I really don't want you to share milking equipment with anybody else that's not on, animals that are not on your farm. That's a really good way to transmit a lot of things. It may be that your clippers dies and you got to borrow one from somebody else. Understandable, but anything we can do to clean that up and disinfect it prior to using it on the next animal is going to benefit us in the long run. I put in here hauling tack mixed with the animals. Not very many people do that, but there is that possibility that an animal passing your tack stall through the hall or through the alleyway there might provide some contamination to it, and then your animals could be exposed that way. Our best approach, don't share anything. Haul your tack separately. This doesn't mean you have to buy all brand new equipment. If you can't, if that's not a possibility, then let's go with that cleaning and disinfecting protocol first. For aerosol transmissions, these are pretty similar to the direct contact, with the difference that if we're dealing with an aerosolized pathogen, putting separation between the animals is going to be helpful to reduce that disease contact. But the best approach is still going to be a completely separate airspace and no mixed hauling. So separate premise again. Fecal oral. Again, just like we've been talking all along, immediate commingling is poor for this one. Another thing that's not great is feeding off the ground. So if we throw the hay on the ground for the goats to eat it, they're going to poop on it. They're going to pick up pathogens that way. So better approach would be to, again, have separate pens, separate feeding equipment, and separate manure handling equipment. Yes, that skid loader does absolutely provide a means for manure to move from pen to pen. And if it's infectious, it's going to come off in the same pen. So cleaning up that equipment if you have to share it before it goes into the next pen. Again, the best approach here, I hate to keep saying it, but if we can provide a space where there's no crossover, even in the care of the animals that we're working with, that's going to be our best approach to avoiding that exposure. This is one place that we need to consider what other animals might be entering our facilities. So I put in here rodents and wild animals, but birds can also apply to this too. Those unfortunate pigeons and starlings can absolutely carry a lot of disease on their feet. So do rodents. So keeping that feed as well protected from those other species as possible, keeping them out of your bunks, employing a rodent control method, trapping those wild animals like raccoons and opossums that get into your barns and getting them out of there. All of those are really important for managing that fecal oral risk. For vectors, I don't really have a good, better, best approach for this one. We're just looking to control our insects, just like we are for just the nuisance part of it. So physical things like traps, netting, screens, or premise sprays that we can use to control insects within our facilities. Topical treatments can be used on our animals. I just want to put a caution out to this. Most of the permethrin-based products are actually registered and approved through the EPA instead of our FDA or USDA groups. And when that happens, there is actually no extra label use of an EPA registered product that's legally allowed. So what that means is if you're using a topical permethrin product, it has to have a goat on the label if you're going to use it on a goat. Even if it's the exact same active drug and concentration as a non-labeled product, to be legal, it has to be labeled for the animal that you're using it in. So before you go and at the show, we've talked about assessing our risk. We've talked about how we can make some adjustments based off of the exposure categories. So what can we do to protect our animals when we're actually at the show? So at this point, I talked a lot about the importance of certificates of veterinary inspection and the on-site inspections that we do at shows. I get to do a lot of show check-ins and a lot of health care for various exhibitions during the year. And I hear a common theme from people saying, well, I don't even know why we have to get these health papers. They never look at them anyway. I find that very unfortunate, actually, because everyone should see the value in having this done. First and foremost, because what we're looking for is obvious contagious and infectious diseases to exclude those animals from participating in the first place. And then the other thing about a CVI is it's a traceability document. So I know that sounds a little bit like Big Brother, but if there would be a disease outbreak at an exhibition, being able to find the animals that were there and went home and help with the control at those premises actually protects our national herd, which is a really important goal for all of us. This does decrease the risk of sick animals arriving at the shows, but it does have limitations. Some diseases are not readily apparent in the carrier state. There's also the possibility of an incubation period. So an animal could be incubating disease and not showing signs of it yet. That's why everyone as owners are critical to this whole process, right? Basically, I'm asking if you have an animal that you're not sure is healthy, that please don't ask to send it, right? It's a tough position for everybody to be in when that occurs. Just a quick picture of what a completely filled out health certificate is for Iowa. These look different depending on where you're at in the country. There's also electronic versions of these available too. What's helpful when it comes time for your vet to write that CVI for you? The animals have to have USDA official identification in the animal at the time of inspection. Handing me an ear tag that's in your hand doesn't count. It has to be identifying the actual animal. For goats and sheep, our gold standard is scrapey tags or scrapey program registered tattoos, which can be the same as your breed registered tattoo. Those are the gold standard for exhibition. In Iowa, we also do allow wethers that are under 18 months old to show with other official ID, like an 840 tag. That's a secondary approach. We'd still prefer to have the scrapey, but only for wethers will they allow that. Each state has its own requirements for what they will allow as official identification. So it's best to check with your vet, check with your state to see what's required in your location. In Iowa, microchips are not allowed. So unfortunately for our poor La Mancha breeders, we're still doing those tail tattoos. Iowa won't recognize even an 840 chip at the current time. Important to note that the state itself imposes the minimum regulations or requirements, but the show or the sale can add more things on top of that. They just can't take away from the minimum requirements. What's helpful? When you have your appointment for your CVI, having your animals caught at the time of the vet's arrival and all the coverings, all the blankets, all the tubes, all the wraps, all that stuff off of them so that they can see them easily. Goats should be clipped. Sheep should be sheared prior to that inspection. Knowing where you're going, the full name and address of the show, having that available. And then if that show or sale has any specific testing or vaccination requirements to participate, having those at least 1 to 2 months ahead of time is really important because of timelines to get all of that kind of stuff done prior to the show starting. Tell your vet if you're going to a sale, because that can change a little bit how we approach writing those papers. I have kind of a long list of things here that's not helpful. And unfortunately, I have been able to experience all of these things. And typically, if I had to break it down, it's just kind of all not such great behavior, right? We don't want to be doing things sneaky, trying to pass things that really shouldn't be going in the first place. We don't want to call somebody else if you get denied and ask them to write a certificate instead. And it's really not fun to be the person that's standing there getting cussed out because the vet denied you a health certificate because the animal had a disease. Just try to remember that we're not just concerned about this one animal. We're concerned about all the animals at the show. Yes, I have had to make the decision to disappoint one kid in order to save disappointment for 50. It's not a fun place to be, but unfortunately that happens sometimes. So what diseases disqualify from our exhibitions? A lot of times we're looking for skin things, right? So that ringworm or clublamb fungus, things here like the foot rot at the bottom of the screen, those outwardly visible things that we can say are contagious or infectious, like respiratory disease, diarrhea, or anything else that's contagious or infectious. I will put a plug in at this point for abscesses. By Iowa rules, it's written that only open or draining abscesses will disqualify, but please don't ask us to put animals on health papers that have an active abscess. It could rupture and drain at any time. And in our small ruminants, that mostly means caseous lymphadenitis or CL, CLA. which is very, very contagious. We don't want to accidentally expose other animals at the show. What do we do about those diseases we can't see? If additional diagnostic testing is required, it may be by the state of destination or by the show or the sale. This is mostly for breeding stock to protect the herds they're going back to. And examples of this include brucellosis, tuberculosis, CAE, things like that. In protection for your actual herd at home, I think this is really an important part of your return home, especially if you're able to keep a separate premise for your show animals. It is important for us to note that these typically are testing for a previous exposure. So these are antibody tests. We're looking for the possibility that that animal is carrying the disease, but they don't necessarily show us a current infection. Work with your vet to develop a routine screening plan, not just for the animals that are going to the exhibitions, but for your herd as a whole. This will allow you the chance to talk about what diseases are most important for you to control and what the frequency of testing or the type of tests that you want to use are to protect your herd overall. Okay, so talked about coming home. We talked about before we go, what do we do when we're at the show? Actually, for the jackpot shows that are starting to allow people to show off of your trailer, I should say off of. I'm sure everyone wants to show off their trailers too, but show off of your trailer. That's actually a fairly good way for us to help protect our animals because we're not taking them into the same building and mixing them with 1,000 others that they've never seen before, right? But if you're going to park that trailer, try to leave at least 4 feet in between your trailer and the one next to you so that you can get that separation. If you're penning them off the trailer, but next to it, the same thing applies. If the show requires you to come in and use a pen, if there's a way you can use a barrier to limit that nose-to-nose contact, like a tarp or a mesh or even anything like that, for sure not a perfect scenario, but will help limit that nose-to-nose contact. Don't forget about your fomite transmission. Don't share equipment whenever possible. And remember, where have your feet been? So if you have your kids that are running over to their friends and they're going on and off of their trailers too, it'd be kind of nice if we had a designated pair of shoes that we could wear onto ours then to limit what we carry into our own facilities. Remember, a separate premise equals a separate group. So even if they're your really, really good friends, it's still considered a mixing risk if you're combining animals or crossing from trailer to trailer. This one unfortunately happens a lot where you get to the show and you're required to pen indoors in a building and you get in there and it's not cleaned up completely, right? So there's some leftover bedding, maybe some feed. Worst case scenario, there's some feces left in there. Cleaning, sweeping that out as much as possible before you put your animals in there. If it's really dirty, find a show official and complain. We really should not be asked to put our animals into a pen that has feces left in it, especially if it's a diarrhea situation. Consider using mats, artificial turf, mesh, things like that underneath your bedding just to help control the exposure from concrete. Unfortunately, concrete is porous and it can bring stuff back out. Place your tack stalls between groups of animals. So if you are able to place a tack stall between yours and the next pen over that's not your animals, that'll decrease some of their nose-to-nose contact too. And this one's really tough with goats because we all know how much they like to eat with their heads and their feet off the ground. If there's a way we can keep them from climbing up over the top and getting into contact with the ones next to them, we can try that approach too. This for me is not about telling on your neighbors. So this is more about if you have a concern about one of your animals, to come to the staff and ask to have that animal evaluated. Yes, I understand that sometimes that may mean that we tell you, I'm sorry, but this animal can't go into the ring because it's too sick to go in. But we don't want to hide that because the longer we do, the more chance there is of it passing to something else. If there is a serious concern for a neighboring pen and they are not addressing it, you can talk to your staff about that too. There are some things we can do. We just don't want to get into a he said, she said match while we're at those shows. We kind of already talked about returning home when we talked about the different modes of transmission. But in this slide here, we're going to mostly talk about what's okay, better, and best for that return home in terms of separation and quarantine periods. So, okay, separate with no nose-to-nose contact, but we have to be in the same facility for a minimum of 14 days. A better approach would be if we could quarantine in a separate facility on the same premise for that time frame. And again, our best approach if we can use a separate premise for that show stock versus that breeding stock. Don't forget about the boots, the tack, the clothing that you used on the show grounds. So if you went to a show and you got dirty boots from that, they don't go back into the barn with the rest of the herd until we've got them all cleaned up and disinfected. Just a few resources here. Again, I'm going to put that plug in for the Center for Food Safety and Public Health. They have some excellent risk assessment tools and planning tools for biosecurity on that site. I really like their disinfection information too, because I've learned a lot through looking at that, and not just what are out there for different compounds that you can use, but how long they actually have to touch the object before they'll kill the various bacteria or viruses that we're trying to take care of. That's all on that website. If you got kids that are in 4-H or FFA, they have a nice little online course called Bring Home the Blue, Not the Flu. And that's designated towards trying to help those 4-Hers and FFA kids understand the same stuff we're talking about here for them to protect their animals. You will note in that course, they recommend a shorter quarantine period. Part of that is because we're talking swine for that course. I extended the quarantine period here because some of our respiratory diseases in goats take longer to develop than things for pigs. Finally, USDA and the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship have online information available for you as well for your planning purposes. And then every single certification program, from the farm program to BQA, PQA, et cetera, all of those are going to have a biosecurity component listed in their documents as well. Last but not least, don't be afraid to reach out to your vet. In our practice and also with the students that we're teaching, we view this as a relationship, right? So our relationship with our clients is a two-way street. And I want to work with them, not above or below each other. And so work with your vet to kind of get some of this stuff figured out. Sometimes just a second set of eyes sees things that another one might not. So with that, my email is up there on the screen. If you have questions or you think of something later that you want to run by me, email is going to be the best way to reach those. I'm not in my office very often. Mostly my office is a Ford vet truck. So if you shoot me an email, I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. So with that, we'll open it up for questions.
I'll kick it off with one question. Explain maybe the relationship or the difference between the VCPR, the veterinary client patient relationship, and a CVI, because they're different, right? So just making
Yes.
sure we understand the difference between
Understand.
those.
Yes. So a VCPR, or a vet client patient relationship, basically means that you have a working agreement with your veterinarian so that your vet has a sufficient knowledge of your farm, your animals, and kind of what goes on with your production system. So that's super broad because it's meant to apply to people that have one pet goat in their backyard on their acreage, all the way to the 80,000, 100,000 cow feedlots, right? Excuse me. And each state has a little bit different way that they define that. In Iowa, we have to be on farm in person at least once a year in order to qualify for a vet client patient relationship. So if you call my clinic and it's been a year and a half since we've been out to your farm and you want to pick up a bottle of penicillin, let's say, for example, I'm going to need to make a visit out to your farm to see your animals before I can legally prescribe that treatment of any kind, right? For most people, that once a year thing is really not a huge issue because we're already working pretty closely together there. Where it can be a little bit of an issue is if you move to a new area and you don't have that established contact yet. So if you're moving or you're going to be moving your herd somewhere else, always a great idea to just contact a local clinic, have them out to meet them and talk about what your goals are, how you approach your animals, and their treatment and their husbandry and stuff like that. I honestly think that we're interviewing each other, right? So if you're new to a practice, it's okay to say, I don't know if this is the right fit for me, because you really want it to be a productive relationship both ways. You want to be able to work well with your vet. Trusting each other is huge for that, right? So if it's not a working relationship and you have another option, it's okay. And it's okay for them to do the same thing, to tell you, I think you'd be better served, with a different clinic instead. Once you have that relationship established, the certificate of veterinary inspection, or otherwise known as health papers or a health chart, that's really a document that's a legal document that says that that animal has been inspected by an accredited veterinarian. So we have to go through additional training to get that accreditation status, and that it has met all the requirements necessary to transport that animal to a show or a sale or go to a new owner or anything like that, right? And so each one of those, each state has a little bit different requirements for different species. And so it's helpful. That's part of the reason why I ask that ahead of time you let me know where you're headed and what it's for, so that I can double check requirements, especially if you're going across state lines. So when you get there, you don't get stopped and they go, oh, wait, you were supposed to have done this testing and you don't have that done right now, And so that's helpful for us to plan ahead. So you need the relationship with the vet first, and then the vet can write the health papers for you to actually attend that exhibition or sell that animal, or, anything like that to go with. When in doubt, just call and ask is the best thing to do.
Thanks for clarifying that. Any
Mhm.
other questions that came in? Fred, did you see any come in, or do you have any questions?
Yeah, one that I get asked a lot early on in the show season and all during the show season is, and I'm going to paraphrase it here. I bought this lamb from so and so, and they said to make sure I get him on probiotics before the show and give him a shot of whatever. What help clear the air? What's that all about?
So the probiotics and the feed kind of things like that, I'm fine with stuff like that. I'm also fine with offering electrolytes along with your water, not as a source, or not source, sole source of drinking. Keeping our animals hydrated, keeping them on a steady plane of nutrition that's appropriate for that species and their production goals. Keeping things as consistent as possible is going to reduce the stress for our animals. The antibiotics are a little bit different story, because we kind of have this thought process that if I give this antibiotic before we travel, that it's going to prevent our animal from getting sick because it'll already have it on board, the prophylactic use. Unfortunately, that doesn't actually work that way. That our thought process there is like we're kind of trying to put a bubble around them is what we think of. Instead, at best, what it does is it delays the onset of disease, so they can still get exposed, they can still get infected. That virus sits there, that bacteria, especially, I should have said bacteria in the first place, because antibiotics are not effective against viruses, right? But that bacteria is just going to sit up there in those nasal passages in that gut and basically wait for that antibiotic to run out. And then it can cause infection. In the worst case scenario, we're exposing the bugs that are naturally there already, and they're developing resistance. And so later on, that might not work for us. So I see affidavits every year where each show we went to, we used a different class of antibiotic. And I really would prefer to not take that approach if at all possible, because again, no evidence that it's actually effective at preventing infection. And in the worst case, it could actually be making it, worse for you in the long run. That's a great question, by the way. While people are thinking about their questions too, you all gathered from this presentation that biosecurity is really not rocket science. It's all common sense approaches. Once you think about the different ways that animals can get exposed to disease, now you can start thinking about, where is the direct contact coming in? What are my possible fomites and things like that? So we really don't, when we take these approaches, we want to keep them as simple as possible. We don't want to make this more difficult than it needs to be. And when you're designing a program too, keep in mind that human behavior is our biggest wild card for all of this, right? So if I make something way too difficult, if I tell my students that they have to dress in full Tyvek in the summer heat and plastic booties and gloves and goggles and a mask for every call that they go on, they're not going to be likely to do anything, right? And so as we're designing these approaches, we want to make them practical and feasible too, so that they actually will get done. Otherwise, we're all human. We all cut corners. And so we want to keep it as simple as we can when we're developing them.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think we'll conclude. And again, appreciate you being on the webinar here today, and we'll get those handouts to everybody in our follow-up email as well. And we look forward to visiting with you in September as well, because you're going to be our presenter talking about respiratory health. So another great topic as we come into the fall and winter season too. So wish everybody a safe and healthy show season, and we look forward to seeing everybody soon.
All right. Thanks,
Thanks.
guys. Mm-hmm.